Hello, BookTube. Here we are in our first read-along of Homer's Iliad. We're doing the first 6 books, in which there's quite a bit. If you're coming to Homer cold, you are going to feel plunged straightway into a completely new world. Maybe one that you weren't expecting. And the feeling of plunging in abruptly, without any preparation, it has been familiar to readers of Homer for 2,000 years. This is the phrase in media res. This is how Homer starts things. This is how this book starts. It starts years and years into a long war between the city-states of Greece and the great empire of Troy. And we don't see the war's beginning, and we don't see the war's end. And in a more minute sense, this poem starts with a dramatic incident in the Greek army, something that will change the course of the war, at least for a little while. The Greeks are far from home, of course, so they need to raid coastal cities in order to keep morale up, in order to keep a constant stream of booty to the troops so they don't get mutinous, and also for supplies. And on these coastal raids, they abduct young women as war prizes for notable warriors. And on a recent raid, one of the women who's abducted is the daughter of a priest of Apollo, who's grief-stricken, of course, and who appears to have the god's ear. And he goes to the Greek camp with treasure and with all of his emblems of office, so they know exactly who he is, and he begs for her back. And Agamemnon, the high king of the Greeks and the leader of the Greek expedition, and it doesn't take you long reading Homer to realize also a bit of a ponce, sends him away with a flea in his ear. We don't want to hear from you, get lost. Which is not how you treat an envoy of the gods. And when the priest of Apollo complains to Apollo, Apollo takes action. He sickens the Greek camp. We're told in a little bit of a tiny vestige, a tiny holdover of historical truth. We're told that when he visits a plague on the Greek camp, it starts with the animals and moves on to humans, which of course, if Apollo in a purely mythological story with no historical grounding at all, were taking revenge on the Greeks for a slight against the dignity of his priest, he wouldn't attack the animals. A plague might attack the animals first. But anyway, it brings on a crisis. And naturally it makes the Greeks, including Agamemnon, want to know what's going on. What is causing this? It's obviously a god, but how did we offend a god? We've been punctilious in our sacrifices. I think the impression is that pretty much everybody knows at least one recent offense that the Greeks, in the form of their high king, have given to the gods, but nobody says anything. Instead, they call for a soothsayer, the soothsayer who is attached to the army, to read the signs. And he does. He does read the signs. First, he asks for protection, because he knows perfectly well what he's going to say, and so does everybody else. And Achilles, the young leader of the Myrmidons, a fierce warrior contingent of the Greek force, and also himself the fiercest of all the Greek warriors, the best warrior, supernaturally gifted, promises the old man protection. And so the old man immediately says the reason is because of Agamemnon, because he abused a priest of Apollo. He needs to apologize, and he needs to give the girl back. And Agamemnon, in what won't be the last Nixonian touch of aggrieved paranoia and self-pity, goes on and on about how this guy's prophecies always work against me. Of course he's pointing at me. You're all jealous of me. I'm better than all of you. And he threatens the priest, and Achilles says, you can't threaten him. He's under my protection. And Agamemnon rounds on Achilles and says, well, keep in mind, you're nothing. I'm far more powerful than you are. I'm your king. I'm your high king. I brought you here in this expedition. These aren't easy words for Achilles to hear when he's at the forefront of every engagement, and Agamemnon, by implication, by very strong implication, is not. And Agamemnon doubles down and says, well, if I have to give up this girl, I'll take yours. This outrages Achilles. You get the strong impression when reading this in Homer that no one has ever treated Achilles this way before. He's not very old. You get the impression that he's been sort of spoiled his whole life. And he's furious when Agamemnon sends 2 thugs to take her from his encampment. He's furious. He doesn't take his anger out on them. But he decides right then to leave the war and to pull his troops out of the war. And that's a big deal. That's a huge decision. He isn't quite deciding to leave because he clearly wants Agamemnon to come back to him in a basement with apologies. Although, because this poem is largely about his wrath, and because wrath is different from anger in that it is totally irrational, even later on in the poem when Agamemnon does exactly that, it isn't enough anymore. His wrath grows. The longer it's alive, the worse it gets. And at that moment, instead of just surrendering the girl and pulling his troops out of war, Achilles does something horrible. He does something that it would not happen in anger. It happens only in the exports of wrath. He calls to his mother, who's a sea goddess, and tells her that he wants her to intervene on Mount Olympus with the gods and get them to tilt the favor of the war against the Greeks, against his own people, to make them extra sorry that they alienated him. And she's reluctant, of course, but she agrees eventually and goes to Mount Olympus, and she pleads and begs with Jupiter, the king of the gods, and he agrees, and then things take an extra pitch. From that point on, for the rest of the poem, the action, the nail-biting suspense, if you want to call it that, the back and forth between the forces, takes an extra pitch that we get the strong impression has not been true for years. But first, before we get that, as I'm sure you all noticed when you were reading this, first, the action stops, rather famously. There's a famous phrase in literature that even Homer occasionally nods. And what that means is that even the best storyteller can occasionally be asleep at the wheel, and what that refers to is the infamous catalogue of ships, where King Priam of Troy has all the different leaders and their nations and their ships and their men-at-arms and their various legends about them recounted to him, as if he wouldn't already know that after years of war. And the purpose of that long stretch, which kills a lot of first-time Iliad readers, I always tell them, skip it. Skip the entirety of Book 2 and move on from there. But the purpose of it has its genesis in the performance of this poem as an oral piece. You have these set pieces that do honor to all these different, the legendary, semi-legendary, mythopoetic ancestors of all these Greek houses. Of course you want, the ancestor of your house to get a name check at the beginning of the poem, because you don't know what kind of shape you're going to be in at the end of it. You want your guests to all be there at the beginning. They'll all be there 40 minutes in. So if you're from Thrace, if you're the king of Thrace, and you have a famous ancestor who allegedly was at Troy, you want his name mentioned. You want your family legends brought up fairly early in the poem. It's unfortunate, I agree. I have taught this poem many, many times, and it's rough. You get to the catalogue of ships and you keep expecting something to happen, and it doesn't. It's just a roll call. Fortunately, right after that, the lid blows off the narrative. The action is non-stop, almost for the rest of the 6 books that we're reading. And it's not just mortal versus mortal. It's gods versus mortal. The gods take part, direct hand part in warfare. And they don't always just trounce, which is fascinating. Because you're reading this and you're thinking along the lines of, I don't even know, the Judeo-Christian God from the Old Testament, if he were to appear directly, personally, on a battlefield. But these gods can be wounded. They can be discouraged, and they fight amongst themselves an enormous amount. We notice that right away, even before they enter the war, that they fight and quarrel and quibble amongst themselves. Jupiter is the strongest of them all. He's their king. But he doesn't seem very nice. One of the first things he does in the poem is threaten his wife, Juno, with laying hands on her. And when the gods enter the battle, they have their own chosen sides. Some are for Troy, and some are for Greece. And at a couple of points, they come into direct conflict with mortals. One of the Greek warriors, a great warrior in his own right, Diomedes, wounds Venus, the goddess of love, who's on the battlefield even though she's not fit for war. She's on the battlefield because Aeneas, one of the greatest of the Trojan warriors, is her son. That she just can't leave him alone. She hovers over him. She helps him a number of times. She saves his life a number of times in the course of the poem, and in the course of the Aeneid, which is all about him. He still has her favor. But when she gets in the way of a seasoned warrior, he wounds her, and of course the gods can't be killed. She goes crying back to Olympus, where she's healed almost instantly. But later on, the gods fight between themselves. Minerva fights with Mars. These two warlike Olympians fight with each other right there on the field of battle. And when Mars flies back to Olympus wounded, and his father Jupiter eventually heals him, it's not without really harsh words. Jupiter can't stand him, and he says so directly. He says, of all my children, of all the gods, you're the one I like the least. Whereas Minerva is obviously his chosen, his favorite, and has no trouble dispatching her male counterpart. None whatsoever. But also, the perspective is never really lost. Yes, this one Greek soldier is having a massive amount of success on the field, but when it goes to his head, and he tries to attack Apollo rebuffs him easily and says, remember your place. Don't try to fight with an immortal. And that fury, even when the gods aren't present, is so starkly memorable. It isn't like we think of epic poem or epic novel violence, which is always grand and full of symphonic movements. Homer's violence is very different. I'm sure if you're reading this for the first time, you'll notice it right away. His violence is very real. It's very visceral. I have a little bit here. This is from a prose translation, but it'll do just as well. Just one random moment in the midst of the Diomedes running rampant all over the field and having his way with the Trojans. This is not Diomedes. This is the offended man himself, Menelaus, the brother of Agamemnon and the husband of Helen of Troy, who was going to be Helen of Sparta until she's abducted and brought to Troy. And this is just in the middle of warfare. This is Menelaus, of course, is a major character, but these others aren't. It's just a moment. Homer gives us a moment and then goes on. Then they killed Pylaemenes, Ares' equal, commander of the great-hearted, shield-bearing Paphlagonians. He was standing stock still when a great spearman Menelaus stabbed him with his spear on the collarbone. Meanwhile, Antilochus hit his attendant, the charioteer Mydon, who was wheeling the horses around. Antilochus hit him full on the elbow with a rock, and the reins, white with their ivory decorations, dropped from his hands and fell in the dust. Antilochus leapt in and drove his sword into the man's temple. With a gasp, he fell headlong from the well-made chariot upon his head and shoulders in the dust. For a while he stuck there, since it happened that the dust was deep at that point. Then his horses kicked him down and laid him flat on the ground. With a lash of the whip, Antilochus drove the horses back into the Greek army. We get a little moment there where we see a character's death. We don't hear anything about the character. He may have been a famous ancestor of someone who's in the audience. Might be why you're mentioning him by name. But we get not only a mention of him when we're never going to hear him again, we get the exact photograph of his death, the white leather reins. And the fact that when he fell, when he pitches headlong into the ground, he momentarily stands straight up, head in the dirt, legs and arms up in the air, already dead. It has to be kicked flat by his own horses, which are then taken. It's an amazing moment, and it happens over and over and over again. And the amazing thing, I think, about the battle scenes of Homer, which happen many times throughout these books and the whole rest of the epic, is that Homer shifts the register and the speed and the tempo of these things so expertly that you never become jaded to their horror. No matter how he shows you that this nameless walk-on is getting stabbed in the guts and having his guts come out along the shaft of the spear, or getting stabbed in the lungs, and then we get a very anatomically correct description of what would happen if that happened. Or in this case, he gets jabbed along the collarbone, or he has his arm shattered by one of the rocks that these warriors throw throughout the course of this epic. He shifts these things up so expertly that the visceral nature, the visceral horror of hand-to-hand fighting in the hot dirt on the plain of Troy is never normal. We never become inured to it. And I think that's incredible. I think it's a mark of genius. But also, you see other things too that are genius, even in these first 6 books. You see that he has a way with character. The register of people that he mainly displays by the fact that no group gets along with itself. There's a huge amount of infighting among the Greeks, in my opinion, largely because they're being ineptly handled. At one point, High King Agamemnon gets a dream from Olympus telling him, "You're bound to conquer. You are destined. Go forth. Troy is yours." And he decides that rather than convey that to the men, who are obviously demoralized after years and years and years without a consummation to their fighting, instead of telling them that, he decides to lie to them about that. He decides to tell them just the opposite. That he had a dream in which it was foretold that they're all going to die. And he's doing it to test their loyalty and morale, and what he sees anybody could have foreseen, which is that they bolt for the ships. If the gods are against them, they're perfectly happy to go home. He has to order them back, including with a signature scene where a signature moment where one of the soldiers, a slack lout named Thersites, is beaten nearly senseless. He's beaten until he cries for mercy by Ulysses, by one of Agamemnon's kings, for speaking up. He speaks up. He's become sort of an emblem for later Homeric criticism as a voice of the common man, where he speaks up and says, "Well, why are we doing this? If the gods are against us, you're a manipulator, you're high above us, you stand to profit no matter what we do," all that sort of stuff. And he's beaten nearly senseless for it. But it's not just the Greeks who fight amongst themselves, although they do. It's not just Agamemnon. The Greeks are sniping at each other constantly. And it's not just the gods who fight amongst each other and have their loyalties and their hatreds. It's also the Trojans. The Trojans also are riven with antagonisms towards each other. A high-ranked, very powerful guest king who's brought his forces to Troy, even though Greece never did anything to him, at one point rails at Prince Hector himself, the greatest of all the Trojan warriors, the leader of the Trojans. And Prince Hector has absolutely no love at all for his half-brother Prince Paris, who is the man who abducted Helen and brought all this misery on the city in the first place. He has no love for him whatsoever. And I don't want to drag this out with moment by moment itemization. Unless you want me to, I would be happy to go through that through this poem bit by bit, since I read it every year and absolutely love it. But what I really want to know, as usual, but especially now in this case, since unlike the Gospels, the Iliad, it's possible that you will never have encountered it in any form. And I really want to know. I mean, I want to know the reactions of any of you reading this even for the 3rd or 4th time, but I also want to know, especially those of you who are encountering it for the first time, what are you making of it? What do you make of it? Did you, for instance, take my advice to prepare yourself ahead of time? Because keep in mind, no audience in ancient Greece ever heard this poem cold. They had been raised from the cradle with stories from this mythological cycle. This whole mythological tapestry was well familiar to them. So I've always told people, and I mentioned it last time when we were talking about this, that one of the smallest but most essential things you can do to help your own enjoyment of this poem is to put yourself roughly in their position, as close as you can get, by familiarizing yourself with the story ahead of time. You're not supposed to know what's going on because Homer is telling you. Homer is assuming that you know. He doesn't tell you much. He doesn't tell you a whole bunch of essential stuff. Did you do that? And if you did it help? And whether you did or not, what did you make of all this to and fro? I'm assuming that all of you, since all of you are on BookTube, you're all hardy, experienced readers. I'm assuming that you dealt with the catalog of the ships somehow, and that you didn't just stop there. But when you got past it, to all of this vivid action, single duels, rescues at the last minute by goddesses, when you got to all of that and all of these characters, what did you make of them all? What translation are you using, for instance? You've all gone out and found some translation of your own, depending on what your library or used bookstores or your library at home had. Is there, by random chance, a consensus? Is there a popular translation that you're all using? I would imagine that the one that would be most widespread would be the Robert Fagel's translation. I would imagine that would be the one most of you would have used in school, if you read the Iliad in school. I'd imagine that would be the one that would be most prominent in any of your bookstores. But I'm curious to know what you're making of all of this here at the end of Book 6. Were you thrilled? Were you revolted by the visceral warfare? Were there any characters that you particularly ended up liking, that they were hoping you'll see more of as the poem goes on? And the poem will go on. We're gonna pick this up next week with books 7 through 12, and talk more about what's going on, because the whole thing deepens. The Achilles' decision to withdraw from the war throws the balance of power into chaos. That, plus the direct intervention of god after god after god, makes things even worse, and there are more tangles to come. So let me know everything about your reactions to this thing. And one little thing I should probably mention as we go along, as we have 3 more weeks. I first encountered this poem and all of the characters in it in the Roman context, not in the Greek context. And you may notice that in the course of these discussions of mine, because when I get going, I'll try my best to accommodate the fact that everyone is reading this with Greek names. I'll try my best. The last thing I want, in addition to all of the that's unfamiliar in the poem, is for you to be listening to me and saying, "Who the heck is that?" But you may notice, I'm going to try to be extra conscious of it. You may notice when I get going, when I get really enthusiastic talking about this, I may slip and use Roman names for some of these characters. So that would be Jupiter instead of Zeus. That would be Juno instead of Hera. That would be Neptune instead of Poseidon. That would be Mercury instead of Hermes. Stuff like that. I apologize for that. I will try to be extra conscious of it. But I learned to know these myths and to love them with their Roman names, and it sometimes sticks with me, especially when I get going. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, because I'm mainly interested in your reactions. Here we are in the first installment. We have started the Iliad. You're 6 books in. What do you think? Where do you stand now? I'd love to hear that. I never fail being interested in hearing that. But anyway, I'm going to end this for now, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, Book 2.